Chapter 15. Effect of circulation time on the magnitude of the capital advanced. In this chapter, and the one following, we deal with the influence of circulation time on the valorization of capital. First example. Let us consider a commodity capital that is the product of a working period of 9 weeks, for example. We abstract for the time being both from the portion of the product's value that is added to it by the average wear and tear of the fixed capital and from the surplus value added to it during the production process, so that the value of this product can be taken as equal to the value of the fluid capital advanced for its production, i.e. the value of the wages and of the raw and ancillary materials consumed in its production. Let this value be £900, so that the weekly outlay amounts to £100. The periodic production time, which coincides here with the working period, is 9 weeks. It is immaterial in this connection whether we assume a working period for a continuous product or a continuous working period for a discrete product, as long as the quantum of the discrete product that is put on the market at one stroke simply takes 9 weeks' labor. Let the circulation time be 3 weeks. The total turnover period is then 12 weeks. After 9 weeks have elapsed, the productive capital advanced is transformed into commodity capital, but it now has to spend 3 weeks in the circulation period. Thus, the new cycle of production can begin again only at the start of the 13th week, and production is at a standstill for 3 weeks, or a quarter of the total circulation period. It is also immaterial whether we suppose that this is the average time that it takes to sell the commodity, or whether the time is determined by the distance of the market, or, alternatively again, by the date of payment for the commodity sold. In every 3 months, production is at a halt for 3 weeks, i.e. for 4 times 3 equals 12 weeks equals 3 months of the year, or a quarter of the annual turnover period. Hence, if production is to be continuous, pursued on the same scale week in, week out, there are only 2 possibilities. One possibility is that the scale of production is cut back, so that the sum of £900 is now sufficient to keep work going during the circulation time of the first turnover as well as during the working period. A second working period is then begun in the 10th week, and thus a new turnover period as well, before the first turnover period is at an end, since the turnover period is a 12-week one while the working period is 9 weeks. £900 divided by 12 weeks gives £75 per week. It is clear straight away that a cut of this kind in the scale of business presupposes different dimensions for the fixed capital, and thus a reduced investment in general. It is questionable, however, whether this reduction can always be made, since the development of production in the various branches of industry sets a normal minimum of capital investment below which the business in question will cease to be competitive. This normal minimum itself grows steadily with the development of capitalist production, and so it is in no way fixed. Between the normal minimum at any time and the normal maximum, which is itself continuously on the increase, there are several intermediate levels, a middle range that permits varying degrees of capital investment. Within the bounds of this middle range, therefore, there can be reduction in scale, the limits to this being fixed by the normal minimum at the time. In the case of a holdup of production, oversupply of markets, increase in prices of raw materials, etc., the limitation on the normal outlay of circulation capital in relation to a given basis of fixed capital takes the form of a limitation of working hours, for example, only half the day being worked, just as in periods of prosperity there is an abnormal extension of the circulating capital on the given basis of fixed capital, partly by the prolongation of working hours, partly by their intensification. With businesses that have always to reckon with fluctuations of this kind, these are coped with partly by the above means and partly also by the employment of a larger number of workers, combined with a reserve of fixed capital, for example, reserve locomotives on the railways, etc. Here we leave such abnormal fluctuations out of account, as we are assuming normal conditions. For production to be continuous, the same circulating capital must be distributed in this case over a longer period of time, over 12 weeks instead of 9. In any given interval of time, therefore, the productive capital function is reduced. The fluid part of the productive capital is reduced from 100 to 75, i.e. by a quarter. The total sum by which the productive capital functioning during the 9-week working period is reduced is 9 times 25, equaling £225, or a quarter of the £900. But the ratio of the circulation time to the turnover period is also 3 over 12, equaling 1 quarter. It follows, therefore, that if production is not to be interrupted during the circulation time of the productive capital that had been transformed into commodity capital, if it is rather to be continued simultaneously and continuously week by week, and there is no special circulating capital available for this purpose, the goal can only be attained by reducing the scale of the productive operations, by diminishing the fluid component to the functioning productive capital. The portion of fluid capital thus set free for production during the circulation time is related to the total fluid capital advanced as the circulation time is to the turnover period. As already noted, this applies only to branches of production in which the labor process is continued week in, week out on the same scale, and where the amounts of capital that have to be laid out do not vary between the different working periods, as in agriculture. If, however, we assume the reverse of this, namely that the nature of the investment excludes a reduction in the scale of production, and hence also in the fluid capital to be advanced each week, then the continuity of production can be maintained only by an additional fluid capital, in the above case, one of 300 pounds. During the turnover period of 12 weeks, 1,200 pounds is successively advanced, of which 300 pounds makes a quarter, as does 3 weeks out of 12. After the working period of 9 weeks, the capital value of 900 pounds is transformed from the form of productive capital into that of commodity capital. Its working period is concluded, and this cannot immediately be repeated with the same capital. During the 3 weeks for which the capital exists in the circulation sphere, functioning as commodity capital, it is the same for the production process as if it did not exist at all. We are abstracting here from all credit relations and assume therefore that the capitalist operates only within his own capital. But while the capital advance for the first working period spends 3 weeks in the circulation process, after completing its production process, an additional capital outlay of 300 pounds now functions, so that the continuity of production is not interrupted. The following must now be noted in this connection. Firstly, the working period of the capital of 900 pounds originally advanced is ended after 9 weeks, and yet the capital does not return for another 3 weeks, until the beginning of the 13th week. A new working period, however, is immediately opened with the additional capital of 300 pounds. This is precisely how the continuity of production is maintained. Secondly, the functions of the original capital of 900 pounds and of the capital of 300 pounds newly advanced at the close of the first 9-week working period, which opens the second working period without interruption on the close of the first, are completely separate in their first turnover period, or can at least be separated, whereas in the course of the second turnover period they cut across one another. We can represent the matter more clearly in the following way. First turnover period of 12 weeks. First 9-week working period, the turnover of the capital advanced in this period is completed by the start of the 13th week. During the last 3 weeks, the additional capital of 300 pounds functions, opening the second 9-week working period. Second turnover period. At the start of the 13th week, 900 pounds has returned and is available to begin a new turnover. But the second working period has already opened in the 10th week with the additional 300 pounds. By the beginning of the 13th week, a third of this working period has been completed by means of this capital, and 300 pounds has been transformed from productive capital into products. Since there are only 6 weeks more to go till the end of the second working period, only 2/3 of the returned capital of 900 pounds, i.e. only 600 pounds, can enter the production process of the second working period. 300 pounds of the original 900 pounds is set free to play the same role that the capital of 300 pounds played in the first working period. At the end of the 6th week of the second turnover period, the second working period is concluded. The capital of 900 pounds laid out on it flows back 3 weeks later, i.e. at the end of the 9th week of the second 12-week turnover period. During the 3 weeks of its circulation time, the capital of 300 pounds that was set free enters the scene. This begins the third working period of a capital of 900 pounds, in the 7th week of the second turnover period, or the 19th week of the year. Third turnover period. The end of the 9th week of the second turnover period brought a new reflux of 900 pounds. But the third working period had already begun in the 7th week of this turnover period, and 6 weeks of this have already elapsed by the start of the third turnover. Thus it has only 3 more weeks to run. Of the 900 pounds that returned, only 300 pounds therefore goes into the production process. The fourth working period comprises the remaining 9 weeks of this turnover period, and thus the fourth turnover period until the fifth working period begin together with the 37th week of the year. Second example. In order to simplify the example for purposes of calculation, we shall assume a working period of 5 weeks and a circulation time of 5 weeks, making a turnover period of 10 weeks, 50 weeks to the year, and a capital outlay of 100 pounds per week. Thus the working period requires a fluid capital of 500 pounds, and the circulation time with the additional capital of further 500 pounds. Working periods and turnover times can now be represented as follows. Working period of 1 lasting from week 1 to 5. Producing 500 pounds in commodities and returning at the end of week 10. Working period 2 lasting from weeks 6 to 10, producing 500 pounds in commodities and returning at the end of week 15. Working period 3 lasting from weeks 11 to 15, producing 500 pounds in commodities and returning at the end of week 20. Working period 4 lasting from weeks 16 to 20, producing 500 pounds in commodities and returning at the end of week 25, and working period 5 lasting from weeks 21 to 25, producing 500 pounds in commodities and returning at the end of week 30, etc. If the circulation time was 0, so that the turnover period was the same as the working period, the number of turnovers would simply equal the number of working periods in the year. Hence, with a 5-week working period, 50 divided by 5 is equal to 10, The value of the capital turned over would be 500 times 10 equaling 5,000 pounds. In the above table, where a circulation time of 5 weeks is assumed, a value of 5,000 pounds in commodities is still produced each year, but 1/10 of this, i.e. 500 pounds, is always in the shape of commodity capital and returns only after 5 weeks' delay. At the end of the year, therefore, the product of the 10th working period, weeks 46 to 50, has only completed half of its turnover time, since its circulation time falls into the first 5 weeks of the ensuing year. We now take a third example. A working period of 6 weeks, circulation time of 3 weeks, and a weekly advance for the labor process being 100 pounds. The first working period, weeks 1 to 6. At the end of the 6th week, a commodity capital of 600 pounds, returning at the end of week 9. The second working period, lasting from weeks 7 to 12. 300 pounds additional capital advance during weeks 7 to 9, a return of 600 pounds at the end of week 9. 300 pounds of this advanced in weeks 10 to 12. So that 300 pounds is free at the end of week 12 and 600 pounds present in commodity capital returning at the end of week 15. Third working period, weeks 13 to 18. Advance of the above 300 pounds in weeks 13 to 15, then a return of 600 pounds, of which 300 pounds is advanced for weeks 16 to 18. At the end of week 18, 300 pounds is free in money. 600 pounds is present in commodity capital and returns at the end of week 21. For a more detailed presentation of this case, see heading 2 below. 600 times 9 equals 5,400 pounds worth of commodities, thus produced in 9 working periods, totaling 54 weeks. At the end of the 9th working period, the capitalist has 300 pounds in money and 600 pounds in commodities which have not yet completed their circulation time. When we compare these 3 examples, we find firstly that only in the second example do capital 1 of 500 pounds and additional capital 2, also 500 pounds, successively replace one another so that the 2 portions of capital perform their movements separately. And this is simply because the assumption is made that the case is the highly exceptional one in which the working period and the circulation time form 2 equal halves of the turnover period. In all other cases, no matter what the discrepancy between the 2 sections of the turnover period may be, the movements of these 2 capitals intersect, as in the first and third examples, right from the second turnover period onwards. The capital functioning in the second turnover period is then formed by the additional capital 2 together with a part of capital 1, while the remainder of capital 1 is set free for the original function of capital 2. The capital active during the circulation time of the commodity capital is no longer identical with the capital 2 originally advanced for this purpose, but it is equal to it in value and forms the same aliquot part of the total capital advanced. Secondly, the capital which is functioned during the working period lies idle during the circulation time. In the second example, the capital functions for a working period of 5 weeks and is idle for a circulation period of 5 weeks. Thus, the overall time during which capital 1 is idle amounts to half of every year. However, the additional capital required to maintain the continuity of production during the circulation time is not determined by the total sum of circulation time within the year, but simply by the ratio of circulation time to the turnover period. We assume here, of course, that all the turnovers take place under the same conditions. Hence, it is an additional capital of 500 pounds that is needed in the second example, and not one of 2,500 pounds. This simply follows from the fact that the additional capital enters the turnover just as much as that originally advanced, and so is replaced after a number of turnovers just as the former was. Thirdly, it in no way alters the circumstances considered here if the production time is longer than the working time. The total turnover period is certainly extended by this factor, but this extended turnover does not require any additional capital for the labor process. The additional capital simply has the job of filling up the gaps in the labor process that are due to the circulation time, and so it has to protect production only from disturbances that arise as a result of this circulation time. Disturbances that arise from these specific conditions of production are taken care of in another way, which is not under consideration here. There are, however, businesses where work is done only spasmodically, to order, and in which there can be interruptions between the working periods for this reason. In such cases, the need for additional capital is proportionately reduced. In most types of seasonal work, moreover, there is also a certain limit for this reflux. The same work cannot be repeated the next year with the same capital, if this capital has not meanwhile completed its circulation time. The circulation time may, however, be less than the interval between one production period and the next. In this case, the capital lies idle, unless it is applied in the meantime in another manner. Fourthly, the capital advanced for one working period, for example the 600 pounds in the third example, is laid out partly on raw and ancillary materials, i.e. in a productive stock for the working period, in constant circulating capital, and partly in variable circulating capital, in payment for labor itself. Not all of that part of the capital laid out on constant circulating capital need exist for the same length of time in the form of productive stock. For example, raw material may not be stored for the whole working period, or coal may be procured every 2 weeks. Nonetheless, if we exclude credit here, this part of the capital, insofar as it is not present in the form of a productive stock, must still remain available in the money form in order to be transformed into productive stock according to need. This in no way alters the value of the constant circulating capital advanced for 6 weeks. Wages, on the other hand, quite apart from the money for unforeseen expenses, the specific reserve fund to cope with disturbances are paid at shorter intervals, mostly weekly. So except where the capitalist forces the worker to make particularly long advances of his labor, the capital needed for wages must be present in the money form. When capital returns, therefore, one part must be kept in the form of money for payment of labor, while another part can be transformed into productive stock. The additional capital is divided up just like the original capital, but what distinguishes it from Capital 1 is that it must already be advanced for the entire duration of the first working period of Capital 1, which it is not involved in order to be available for its own working period. This is again abstracting from credit relations. During this time, it can be at least partially transformed already into constant circulating capital. The extent to which it assumes this last form, or else persists in the form of additional money capital until the time that this transformation is necessary, will depend partly on the particular production conditions of the specific lines of business involved, partly on local circumstances, and partly on fluctuations in the prices of raw materials, etc. If we consider the total social capital, then a more or less significant part of this additional capital exists for a prolonged time in the state of money capital. As far as the part of Capital 2 advanced for wages is concerned, however, it is only gradually transformed into labor power, inasmuch as the working periods that elapse and are paid for are relatively short. This part of Capital 2 is thus present in the form of money capital for the whole duration of the working period, until it is transformed into labor power and thus embarks on the function of productive capital. This intervention of the additional capital required for the conversion of Capital 1's circulation time into production time thus not only increases the size of the capital advanced and the length of time for which the total capital has to be advanced, but it also specifically increases that part of the capital advance that exists as a money reserve, i.e., exists in the state of money capital and possesses the form of potential money capital. The same thing occurs, as concerns both an advance of capital in the form of productive stock and that in the form of a money reserve, if the division of capital into two parts that is required by the circulation time, capital for the first working period and replacement capital for the circulation time, is brought about not by an increase in the capital laid out, but instead by a reduction in the scale of production. In relation to the scale of production, the capital confined to the money form increases here still further. What is always attained by this division of the capital into original productive capital and additional capital is the uninterrupted succession of working periods, the steady functioning of an equal-sized part of the capital advanced as productive capital. Let us consider the second example. The capital existing in the production process at any one time is £500. Since the working period is 5 weeks, this capital operates 10 times in every 50 weeks, taken as a year. If we disregard surplus value, the product therefore amounts to 10 times 500 equaling £5,000. From the standpoint of the capital functioning directly and uninterruptedly in the production process, a capital value of £500, the circulation time thus appears to have disappeared completely. The turnover period coincides with the working period. The circulation time is assumed to be 0. But if the capital of £500 were to be regularly inhibited in its productive activity by the circulation time of 5 weeks, so as to be only ready for production once again after completing the entire turnover period of 10 weeks, we should have, in the 50-week year, 5 10-week turnovers. These would include 5 5-week production periods, i.e. a total of 25 weeks production, with a total product of 5 times 500 totaling £2,500, and 5 5-week circulation times, i.e. a total circulation time of also 25 weeks. If we say in this case that the capital of £500 is turned over 5 times in the year, then it is perfectly clear that for half of each turnover period this capital of £500 has not functioned as productive capital at all, and that all things considered, it has functioned only for half the year, and not during the other half. In our example, the replacement capital of £500 enters the scene for the duration of these 5 circulation times, and in this way, the turnover is raised from £2,500 to £5,000. But the capital advanced is now £1,000 instead of £500. 5,000 divided by 1,000 is 5. Thus, instead of 10 turnovers, we have 5. But because it is then said that the capital of £1,000 has turned over 5 times in the year, the memory of the circulation time vanishes from the empty heads of the capitalists, and the confused idea is formed that this capital has functioned constantly in the production process throughout the 5 successive turnovers. However, When we say that the capital of £1,000 has turned over 5 times, we include in this the circulation time as well as the production time. In fact, if £1,000 really had been continuously active in the production process, then the product would have been £10,000 on the basis of our assumptions, instead of £5,000. And in order to have £1,000 continuously in the production process, a capital of £2,000 would have had to be advanced. The economists, who have never produced a clear account of the turnover mechanism, constantly overlook this basic aspect, i.e. the fact that only a part of the industrial capital can actually be engaged in the production process, if production is to proceed without interruption. In other words, one part can function as productive capital only on condition that another part is withdrawn from production proper in the form of commodity or money capital. Since this is overlooked, so also is the importance and role of money capital in general. What we now have to investigate is the difference in the turnover that arises according to whether the two sections of the turnover period, working period and circulation period, are equal, or whether the working period is longer or shorter than the circulation period. Further, how this affects the tying up of capital in the form of money capital. We assume here that the capital advanced each week is in all cases £100, and the turnover period 9 weeks, so that the capital that has to be advanced for each turnover period is £900. Section 1. Working period and circulation period equal. This case, though in reality it is only a chance exception, must serve as the starting point for the discussion, since it is here that conditions are present in their simplest and most palpable form. The two capitals, capital 1, which is to be advanced for the first working period, and additional capital 2, which functions during the circulation period of capital 1, relieve one another in their movements without crossing each other's path. With the exception of the first period, therefore, each of the two capitals is advanced only for its own turnover period. If the turnover period is 9 weeks, as in the following examples, then the working period and circulation period are accordingly both 4.5 weeks. We then have the following schema for a complete year. See Table 1. The aforementioned graphic will not be read aloud for the recording. Please consult a physical or digital copy of the book for visual reference. In the 51 weeks that we take here as the year, Capital 1 has concluded 6 full working periods, and thus produced commodities to the value of 6 times 450, equaling £2,700. Capital 2 has produced commodities for 5 full working periods. 5 times 450 is equal to £2,250. Capital 2 has also produced a further £150 in the final 1.5 weeks of the year, mid-week 50 to the end of week 51, a total product of £5,100 in 51 weeks. As far as the direct production of surplus value is concerned, and this is produced only during the working period itself, the total capital of £900 has turned over 5 2/3 times, 5 2/3 times 900 equaling 5,100. But if we consider the real turnover, then Capital 1 is turned over 5 2/3 times, since at the end of week 51 it has only 3 weeks of its 6 turnover period still to complete, 5 2/3 times 450 equaling £2,550. While Capital 2 is turned over 5 1/6 times, since it has only completed 1.5 weeks of its 6 turnover period, and a further 7.5 weeks of this fall in the coming year. 5 1/6 times 450 totaling £2,325, the real amount turned over being £4,875. We may treat Capital 1 and Capital 2 as two quite independent capitals. In their movements, they are completely autonomous. These movements are complementary only insofar as their working and circulation periods directly relieve one another. They can be considered as two completely independent capitals, belonging to different capitalists. Capital 1 has gone through 5 complete turnover periods in 2/3 of its 6th. It exists at the end of the year in the form of commodity capital, requiring a further 3 weeks for its normal realization. It functions as commodity capital and circulates. As far as its last turnover goes, it has completed only 2/3 of it. This is expressed by saying that it is turned over only 2/3 of a time. Only 2/3 of its total value is turned over completely. We say that £450 completes its turnover in 9 weeks, and therefore £300 does so in 6 weeks. By expressing it in this way, we leave aside the organic relations between the two specific and different components of the turnover time, since the exact sense of the statement that the capital of £450 advanced has made 5 2/3 turnovers is simply that it has made 5 turnovers and only completed 2/3 of its 6th. Nevertheless, the expression that the capital turned over is 5 2/3 of the original capital advanced, thus in the above case 5 2/3 times 450 totaling £2,550 is correct in the sense that if this capital of £450 were not supplemented by another capital of £450, then one part of it would have to exist in the production process and another part in the circulation process. If the turnover time is to be expressed in terms of the quantity of the capital turned over, it can only ever be expressed in a quantity of existing value, in fact, of finished products. The circumstance that the capital advanced does not exist in a state in which it can reopen the production process once again is expressed in the form that only one part of it exists in a state suitable for production, or that, in order to exist in a state of continuous production, the capital must always be divided into one part that is in the production period and another part in the circulation period, according to the ratio between these two periods. This is the same law as that which determines the mass of productive capital functioning at one time by the ratio of circulation time to turnover time. Of capital 2, at the end of week 51, which we take here as the close of the year, 150 pounds is advanced in the production of unfinished products. A further part exists in the form of fluid constant capital, raw material, etc., i.e. in a form in which it can function as productive capital in the production process. But a third part exists in the money form, a quantity at least as great as the amount of wages for the remainder of the working period, 3 weeks, which are paid only at the end of each week. Even though this part of the capital does not exist in the form of productive capital at the beginning of the new year, i.e. of a new turnover cycle, but rather in the form of money capital in which it is incapable of entering the production process, the new turnover nevertheless reopens with fluid variable capital, i.e. living labor power, active in the production process. This phenomenon comes about because although labor power is bought and used at the beginning of the working period, say weekly, it is paid for only at the end of the week. Here, money functions as means of payment. It therefore exists on one hand as money still in the hands of the capitalist, while on the other hand labor power, the commodity into which it is converted and is already active in the production process, and thus the same capital value here appears twofold. If we consider simply the working periods, then capital 1 has produced 6 times 450, totaling 2,700 pounds. Capital 2 has produced 5 1/3 times 450, totaling 2,400 pounds, i.e. together they have produced 5 2/3 times 900, totaling 5,100 pounds. The money capital of 900 pounds advanced has thus functioned as productive capital 5 2/3 times in the year. As far as the production of surplus value is concerned, it is all the same whether 450 pounds in the production process always functions alternately with 450 pounds in the circulation process, or whether 900 pounds functions for 4.5 weeks in the circulation process. If we consider the turnover periods, on the other hand, then capital 1 has turned over 5 2/3 times 450, totaling 2,550 pounds. Capital 2 is turned over 5 1/6 times 450, totaling 2,325 pounds, i.e. the total capital turned over is 5 5/12 times 900, totaling 4,875 pounds. This is because the turnover of the total capital is equal to the amounts of capitals 1 and 2 turned over, divided by the sum of capitals 1 and 2. It should be noted here that capitals 1 and 2, if they really were independent of one another, would still only form different, independent parts of the social capital advanced in the same branch of production. If the social capital in this branch of production consisted only of 1 and 2, the same calculation would hold for the turnover of the social capital in this branch as holds here for the two components 1 and 2 of the same private capital. Any portion of the total social capital in a particular branch of production can be calculated in this way by extension. Finally, the number of turnovers of the total social capital equals the sum of the capital turned over in the various branches of production divided by the sum of the capital advanced in these branches. It should further be noted that, just as here, in the same private business, the two capitals 1 and 2 have, in the strict sense, different turnover years, inasmuch as the turnover cycle of capital 2 begins 4.5 weeks later than that of capital 1, and 1's year therefore comes to a close 4.5 weeks earlier than that of 2, so too the various private capitals in the same branch of production begin business at quite different points in time, and hence complete their annual turnover at different times of the year. The same average calculation that we applied above to 1 and 2 also serves here to reduce the turnover years of the various independent parts of the social capital to a uniform turnover year. Section 2. Working period longer than circulation period. In this case, the working and turnover periods of capitals 1 and 2 cut across one another, instead of following on from each other. We also find capital set free, which was not the position in the case considered previously. This is in no way altered by the fact that now, as previously, 1. The number of working periods of the total capital advanced is equal to the value of the annual product of the 2 years of the capital advanced divided by the total capital advanced, and 2. The number of turnovers of the total capital is equal to the sum of the two amounts turned over, divided by the sum of the two capitals advanced. Here, too, we must consider the two portions of capital as if they perform their turnover movements in complete independence of one another. We assume once again that 100 pounds has to be advanced each week in the labor process. The working period lasts for 6 weeks, and therefore requires an advance of 600 pounds, capital 1. The circulation period is 3 weeks, and so the turnover period as above is 9 weeks. A capital 2 of 300 pounds enters the scene during the 3-week circulation period of capital 1. If we consider the two as independent capitals, then the annual turnover presents itself according to the following schema. See Table 2. The aforementioned graphic will not be read aloud for the recording. Please consult a physical or digital copy of the book for visual reference. The production process proceeds uninterruptedly on the same scale throughout the whole year. Here we have kept the two capitals 1 and 2 completely separate. But in order to present them separately in this way, we have had to cut through their actual intersections and entanglements. According to the above table, for instance, the amounts turned over would be capital 1, 5 2/3 times 600 totaling 3,400 pounds, and capital 2, 5 times 300 totaling 1,500 pounds. For the total capital, 5 4/9 times 900 totaling 4,900 pounds. This is not correct, however, since, as we shall see, the actual production and circulation periods do not entirely coincide with those in the above table, in which the important thing was to exhibit the two capitals 1 and 2 in complete independence from one another. In reality, for instance, capital 2 does not have working and circulation periods separate from those of capital 1. The working period is 6 weeks, the circulation period 3 weeks. Since capital 2 is only 300 pounds, it can serve for only part of a working period. This is in fact the case. At the end of week 6, a product to the value of 600 pounds steps out into circulation, and at the end of week 9, this value returns in money. Capital 2 thus moves into action at the beginning of week 7, and covers the needs of the next working period for weeks 7 to 9. According to our assumption, however, the working period is only half finished by the end of week 9. The capital 1 of 600 pounds that has just returned therefore moves into action once more, and 300 pounds of it meets the advance needed for weeks 10 to 12. The second working period is thus taken care of. A product to the value of 600 pounds is in circulation and will return at the end of week 15. On top of this, however, 300 pounds, the amount of the original capital 2, is set free and can function in the first half of the following working period, i.e. weeks 13 to 15. After this has elapsed, the 600 pounds then returns once again. 300 pounds of it suffices until the close of the working period, while 300 pounds remains free for the following period. The matter now stands as follows. Turnover period 1, weeks 1 to 9. First working period, weeks 1 to 6, capital 1 of 600 pounds functions. First circulation period, weeks 7 to 9. At the end of week 9, 600 pounds returns. Turnover period 2, weeks 7 to 15. Second working period, weeks 7 to 12. First half, weeks 7 to 9, capital 2 of 300 pounds functions. At the end of week 9, 600 pounds returns in money from capital 1. Second half, weeks 10 to 12, 300 pounds of capital 1 functions. The other 300 pounds of capital 1 remains free. Second circulation period, weeks 13 to 15. At the end of week 15, 600 pounds returns in money, formed half from capital 1, half from capital 2. Turnover period 3, weeks 13 to 21. Third working period, weeks 13 to 18. First half, weeks 13 to 15. The 300 pounds set free begins to function. At the end of week 15, 600 pounds returns in money. Second half, weeks 16 to 18. Of the 600 pounds that is returned, 300 pounds functions. The other 300 pounds again remains free. Third circulation period, weeks 19 to 21. At its close, 600 pounds again returns in money. In this 600 pounds, capital 1 and capital 2 have now merged indistinguishably together. In this way, we have 8 full turnover periods of a capital of 600 pounds, up till the end of the 51st week. 1, weeks 1 to 9, 2, 7 to 15, 3, 13 to 21, 4, 19 to 27, 5, 25 to 33, 6, 31 to 39, 7, 37 to 45, 8, 43 to 51. But since weeks 49 to 51 fall in the 8th circulation period, the 300 pounds of capital set free must enter production and keep it going during this time. The turnover thus presents itself as follows at the end of the year. 600 pounds has completed its circuit 8 times, making 4,800 pounds turned over. On top of this, there is the product of the final 3 weeks, 49 to 51, but this has accomplished only a third of its 9-week circuit, and thus counts only for a third of its total amount, i.e. 100 pounds in the sum turned over. So if the annual product of 51 weeks is 5,100 pounds, the capital turned over is only 4,800 plus 100, equaling 4,900 pounds. The total capital advanced was 900 pounds, and this has therefore turned over 5 4/9 times, i.e. slightly less than in case 1. In the present example, we assumed a case in which the working time was 2/3 of the turnover period, and the circulation time 1/3, i.e. the working time was a simple multiple of the circulation time. The question arises whether the setting free of capital noted above also occurs when this is not the case. Let us take a working period of 5 weeks and a circulation time of 4 weeks with a capital advance of £100 per week. Turnover period 1, weeks 1 to 9. First working period, weeks 1 to 5, capital 1 of £500 functions. First circulation period, weeks 6 to 9. At the end of week 9, £500 returns in money. Turnover period 2, weeks 6 to 14. Second working period, weeks 6 to 10. First section, weeks 6 to 9. Capital 2 of £400 functions. At the end of week 9, capital 1 of £500 returns in money. Second section, week 10. £100 out of the returned £500 functions. The remaining £400 stays free for the following working period. Second circulation period, weeks 11 to 14. At the end of week 14, £500 returns in money. Up till the end of week 14, weeks 11 to 14, the £400 that has been set free functions. £100 of the £500 that is thus returned meets the remaining needs of the third working period, weeks 11 to 15, so that a further £400 is set free for the fourth working period. The same phenomenon is repeated in each working period. At its beginning, there is £400 available, which suffices for the first 4 weeks. At the end of the fourth week, £500 returns in money and only £100 of this is needed for the final week, the remaining £400 being free until the next working period. Let us now take a working period of 7 weeks, with capital 1 of £700 at a circulation time of 2 weeks with capital 2 of £200. The first turnover period then lasts from week 1 to week 9, and out of this period the first working period comprises weeks 1 to 7, with an advance of £700, while the first circulation period comprises weeks 8 to 9. At the end of the 9th week, the £700 returns in money. The second turnover period, weeks 8 to 16, includes the second working period of weeks 8 to 14. The needs of weeks 8 and 9 are met by capital 2. At the end of the 9th week, the above £700 returns. £500 of this is used up by the end of the working period, weeks 10 to 14. There remains £200, which is set free for the next working period. The second circulation period covers weeks 15 to 16. At the end of week 16, a further £700 returns. The same phenomenon is now repeated in each working period. The capital needs of the first 2 weeks are met by the £200 set free at the close of the previous working period. At the end of the second week, £700 returns, but the working period now only has a further 5 weeks to run, so that only £500 can be used, and there is always £200 set free for the next working period. It emerges, therefore, that in our present example, where the working period is taken as greater than the circulation period, there is always set free at the close of each working period, under all circumstances, a money capital of the same magnitude as the capital 2, which was advanced for the circulation period. In our 3 examples, capital 2 was £300 in the first, £400 in the second, and £200 in the third, and the capital set free at the close of the working period was accordingly £300, £400, and £200. Section 3. Working period shorter than circulation period. We again start with a turnover period of 9 weeks. The working period is now 3 weeks, the capital 1 required for this being £300. The circulation period is 6 weeks. For these 6 weeks, an additional capital of £600 is needed, which we can however divide up again into 2 capitals of £300, each of these catering for 1 working period. We then have 3 capitals of £300 each, with £300 always occupied in production, while £600 circulates. See Table 3. The aforementioned graphic will not be read aloud for the recording. Please consult a physical or digital copy of the book for visual reference. Here we have the exact counterpart of Case 1, with the simple distinction that 3 capitals now relieve one another instead of 2. There is no intersection or entanglement between the capitals. Each individual capital can be separately traced right through to the end of the year. Just as little as in Case 1, therefore, is any capital set free at the close of a working period. Capital 1 is completely laid out by the end of week 3, completely returns at the end of week 9, and begins to function again at the start of week 10. Similarly with capitals 2 and 3. The even and complete replacement of the capitals excludes the setting free of any part of them. The overall turnover is calculated as follows. Turned over by capital 1, £300 times 5 2/3, £1,700. Turned over by capital 2, £300 times 5 1/3, £1,600. And turned over by capital 3, £300 times 5, £1,500, turned over by the total capital, £900 times 5 1/3, £4,800. We shall now take an example in which the circulation period is not an exact multiple of the working period, i.e. a working period of 4 weeks, a circulation period of 5 weeks. The corresponding sums of capital are thus capital 1, £400, capital 2, £400, and capital 3, £100. The following table only gives the first 3 turnovers. The aforementioned graphic will not be read aloud for the recording. Please consult a physical or digital copy of the book for visual reference. Here, the capitals are intertwined insofar as the working period of capital 3, which does not have an independent working period of its own since it is sufficient only for 1 week, coincides with the first working week of capital 1. For this reason, however, a capital of £100, equal to capital 3, is set free at the close of the working periods of both capitals 1 and 2. If, for instance, capital 3 serves for the first week of the second and all subsequent working periods of capital 1, and at the close of the first week the entire capital 1 of £400 returns, then the remainder of the working period of capital 1 amounts to only 3 weeks, and the corresponding capital outlay is £300. The £100 set free in this way then suffices for the first week of the directly following working period of capital 2. At the close of this week, the entire capital 2 of £400 returns, but since the working period which is in progress can absorb only £300, there remains, at its close once again, £100 set free, and so on. Capital is thus set free at the close of the working period whenever the circulation time is not a simple multiple of the working period, and this capital that is set free is moreover equal to the portion of capital which has to fill in for the excess of the circulation period over a working period, or over a number of working periods. It has been assumed in all the cases investigated that both working time and circulation time remain the same throughout the year in the business under consideration, whatever it may be. This assumption was necessary if we wish to establish the influence of the circulation time on the turnover and on the capital advanced. It is beside the point here that this is not unconditionally the case in reality, and often not at all so. In this whole part, we are considering only the turnovers of circulating capital, and not those of fixed capital. This is for the simple reason that the matter under consideration does not involve the fixed capital. The means of labor, etc., that are applied in the production process only form fixed capital to the extent that the time during which they are in use extends longer than the turnover period of the fluid capital, insofar as the time during which these means of labor endure and serve for constantly repeated labor processes is greater than the turnover period of the fluid capital, i.e. covers a number n of turnover periods of this fluid capital. Whether the overall interval which is formed by these n turnover periods of the fluid capital is longer or shorter, the part of the productive capital that is advanced for this time in the form of fixed capital is not advanced again within the same interval. It goes on functioning in its old use form. The difference is simply that, according to the differing lengths of the individual working period in each turnover period of the fluid capital, the fixed capital surrenders a greater or smaller part of its original value to the product of this working period, and according to the duration of the circulation time in each turnover period, this portion of the value of the fixed capital that is given up to the product returns more quickly or more slowly in the money form. The nature of the object of investigation in this part, the turnover of the circulating part of the productive capital, arises from the nature of this portion of the capital itself. The fluid capital applied in one working period cannot be applied in a new working period before it has completed its turnover, i.e. has been transformed into commodity capital, from the latter into money capital, and then back again into productive capital. In order to follow the first working period directly with the second, therefore, new capital must be advanced, and in sufficient quantity to fill the gaps that arise as a result of the circulating period of the fluid capital that is advanced for the first working period. Hence the influence of the length of the working period of the fluid capital on the scale of the labor process and on the division of the capital advanced, or on the addition of new portions of capital. This, however, is precisely what we are considering in this part. Section 4. Results. The above investigation leads to the following results. A. The various portions in which the capital has to be divided, so that one part of it can always be in its working period while other parts are in their circulation period, relieve each other, like independent private capitals, in 2 cases. 1. If the working period is equal to the circulation period, and the turnover period is thus divided into 2 equal sections. 2. If the circulation period is longer than the working period, but is a simple multiple of it, so that one circulation period equals n working periods, where n must be a whole number. In these cases, no part of the capital successively advanced is set free. B. However, in all cases where 1. The circulation period is greater than the working period, without forming a simple multiple of it, or 2. the working period is greater than the circulation period, a part of the overall fluid capital is always periodically set free at the close of each working period. This capital that is set free, moreover, is equal to the portion of the total capital that is advanced for the circulation period if the working period is greater than the circulation period, and equal to the portion of capital which has to stand in for the excess of the circulation period over a working period or a whole number of working periods if the circulation period is greater than the working period. C. It follows from this that as far as the total social capital is concerned, considering the fluid part of this, the setting free of capital is the rule, while the simple mutual replacement of portions of capital functioning successively in the production process must form the exception. For the equality of working period and circulation period, or the equality of circulation period and a whole number of working periods, in other words, a regular proportion between the two components of the turnover period, has nothing at all to do with the nature of the case, and can therefore occur, by and large, only exceptionally. A very significant portion of the social circulating capital, which is turned over several times in the year, will thus periodically exist in the course of the annual turnover cycle in the form of capital set free. It is also evident that, assuming all other circumstances remain the same, the magnitude of this capital set free will grow with the extent of the labor process or the scale of production, and thus with the development of capitalist production in general. In case B2, simply because the overall capital advanced grows. In B1 for the same reason, and because the length of the circulation period also grows with the development of capitalist production, while the circulation period is not a simple multiple of the working period. In the first case, for example, there was £100 to be laid out each week. This made £600 for a 6-week working period, and £300 for a 3-week circulation period, making a total of £900. Here, £300 was always set free. If, however, £300 was laid out each week, then this would make £1,800 for the working period and £900 for the circulation period, and so £900 would be periodically set free instead of £300. D. The total capital of, for example, £900 must be divided up into two portions, in the above case £600 for the working period and £300 for the circulation period. The portion that is actually laid out in the labor process will therefore diminish by a third, from £900 to £600, and hence the scale of production will also be reduced by a third. The £300, on the other hand, only functions to make the working period continuous, so that in each week of the year, £100 can be laid out in the labor process. Taken abstractly, it is all the same whether £600 operates for 6 times 8, totaling 48 weeks, a product of £4,800, or whether the entire capital of £900 is laid out for 6 weeks in the labor process and then lies idle for a circulation period of 3 weeks. In the latter case, it would operate for 32 weeks, equaling 5 1/3 times 6, out of a total of 48, product being 5 1/3 times 900, totaling £4,800, and lie idle for 16 weeks. But apart from the greater waste of fixed capital during the idle period of 16 weeks, and the increased cost of labor, which has to be paid for the whole year even if only a part of this is worked, a regular interruption of this kind in the production process would be incompatible with the running of modern large-scale industry. Continuity is itself a productive force of labor. If we now look more closely at the capital that is set free, or in actual fact suspended, it is clear that a significant part of this must always possess the form of money capital. Let us stick to the example of a working period of 6 weeks and the circulation period of 3 weeks, weekly outlay £100. In the middle of the second working period, at the end of week 9, £600 returns, of which only £300 has to be laid out during the remainder of the working period. At the end of the second working period, therefore, £300 of this is set free. In what state does this £300 now exist? We shall assume that 1/3 of it is laid out on wages and 2/3 on raw and ancillary materials. Of the £600 that is returned, £200 thus exists in the money form for wages, and £400 in the form of a productive stock, i.e. as elements of the constant circulating productive capital. But since only half of this productive stock is required for the second half of working period 2, the other half exists for 3 weeks in the form of a surplus productive stock, i.e. surplus to the needs of one working period. The capitalist, however, knows that, out of the portion of capital that is returned to him, £400, he needs only 1/2 for the current working period. It will therefore depend on market conditions whether he immediately transforms this £200 completely or partially back into surplus productive stock, or hangs on to it wholly or partly as money capital, in the expectation of more favorable market conditions. It is self-evident, on the other hand, that the part to be laid out on wages, £200, is kept in the money form. The capitalist cannot dispose of labor power once he has bought it as he can the raw material in his storeroom. He has to incorporate it into the production process and pay for it at the end of the week. Of the capital of £300 that has been set free, therefore, this £100 will in any case possess the form of money capital that has been set free, i.e. is not needed for the working period. The capital set free in the form of money capital must therefore be at least equal to the variable portion of the capital that laid out on wages. At the maximum it can include the whole of the capital set free. In reality, it constantly fluctuates between the minimum and the maximum. The money capital that is set free simply by the mechanism of the turnover movement, together with the money capital set free by the successive reflux of the fixed capital, and that needed for variable in every labor process, must play a significant role as soon as the credit system has developed and must also form one of the foundations for this. Let us assume in our example that the circulation time is cut from 3 weeks to 2. This is not a normal occurrence but may be an effect of a good period for business, shortened term for payment, etc. The capital of £600 that was laid out during the working period returns 1 week earlier than needed and is therefore set free for this week. £300, part of that £600, is again set free, as before, in the middle of the working period, but for 4 weeks now instead of 3. Hence, £600 exists on the money market for 1 week, and £300 for 4 weeks instead of 3. Since this does not just affect one single capitalist, but rather several, and occurs at different periods in different branches of industry, a greater quantity of disposable money capital is thereby brought onto the market. If this state of affairs lasts a long time, production will be expanded, where circumstances permit. Capitalists who operate with borrowed capital will exert less demand on the money market, which relieves it as much as does increase supply. Alternatively, the sums that have become superfluous for the turnover mechanism will eventually be definitively thrown out onto the money market. As a result of the contraction of the circulation time from 3 to 2 weeks, and hence of the turnover period from 9 weeks to 8, 1/9 of the total capital advance becomes superfluous. The 6-week working period can now be kept going just as steadily with £800 as it could before with £900. A portion of the commodity capital, £100, therefore once it is turned back into money, persists in this state as money capital, and no longer functions as a part of the capital advance for the production process. While production is continued on the same scale, and with conditions such as prices, etc. remaining otherwise the same, the value of the capital advance declines from £900 to £800. The remaining £100 of the value originally advanced is precipitated out in the form of money capital. As such, it enters the money market and forms an additional part of the capital functioning there. We can see from this how a surfeit of money capital can arise, and not only in the sense that the supply of money capital is greater than the demand for it. The latter is never more than a relative surplus, which is found, for instance, in the depressed period that opens the new business cycle after the crisis is over. It is rather in the sense that a definite part of the capital advanced is superfluous for the overall process of social reproduction, which includes the circulation process, and is therefore precipitated out in the form of money capital. It is thus a surplus which has arisen with the scale of production and prices remaining the same, simply by a contraction in the turnover period. The mass of money in circulation, whether this is larger or smaller, does not have the slightest influence on this. Let us assume inversely that the circulation period is extended, say from 3 weeks to 5. Then, when the next turnover takes place, the reflux of the capital advanced is already 2 weeks too late. The last part of the production process of this working period cannot be completed simply through the turnover mechanism of the capital originally advanced. If the situation continues for much longer, there will be a contraction of the production process, i.e., a reduction of the scale on which it is conducted, just as in the previous case there was an expansion. In order to continue the process on the same scale, the capital advanced would have to be increased by 2/9, totaling £200, for the entire duration, to cope with this prolongation of the circulation period. This additional capital can be obtained only from the money market. If the prolongation of the circulation period affects one or more major lines of business, then it may exert pressure on the money market, if this effect is not cancelled out by a counter-effect from another direction. In this case, too, it is manifestly evident that this pressure, just like the surplus in the previous case, has nothing to do with a change either in the prices of commodities or in the quantity of the available means of circulation. Section 5. Effect of changes in price. We have so far assumed that prices in the scale of production stay the same, while there is a contraction or expansion in the circulation time. Let us now assume, by way of contrast, a constant turnover period and a constant scale of production but a change in price, i.e. a fall or rise in the price of raw materials, ancillaries, and labor, or of the first two of these elements. Let us say that the price of raw materials and ancillaries falls by a half. In our example, only £50 would then be needed each week instead of £100, and £450 for the 9-week turnover period instead of £900. £450 of the capital value advanced will at first be precipitated out as money capital, but the production process will be continued on the same scale, with the same turnover period and the same division within this. The annual product will remain the same in volume, but its value will fall by 1/2. It is neither an accelerated circulation that has led to this, nor a change in the quantity of money in circulation, but it is still accompanied by a change in the supply of and demand for money capital. The converse is also true. The initial effect of a fall of 1/2 in the value or price of the elements of productive capital would be that the capital value that has to be advanced for business X, continued on the same scale as before, would be reduced by 1/2, and so business X would also have to cast only half as much money into the market, since it is in the form of money, i.e. as money capital, that business X originally advances this capital value. The quantity of money cast into circulation would decline, because the price of the elements of production had fallen. This would be the first effect. Secondly, however, half of the capital value of £900 originally advanced, i.e. £450, whether A, alternately passed through the forms of money capital, productive capital, and commodity capital, or B, existed simultaneously and contiguously, partly in the form of money capital, partly as productive capital, and partly as commodity capital, would be precipitated out from the circuit of business X, and would therefore enter the money market as additional money capital, and function there as an additional component. This £450 set free in money functions as money capital not because it is money that has become superfluous for the conduct of business X, but rather because it is a component of the original capital value, hence continues to operate as capital and is not spent as a mere means of circulation. The most direct form in which it can be made to operate as capital is if it is placed on the money market as money capital. Alternatively, the scale of production could be doubled, ignoring the fixed capital. A production process of double the scale could then be conducted with the same capital advance of £900. If the prices of the fluid elements of the productive capital were to rise by 1/2, on the other hand, so that instead of £100 a week, £150 was necessary, and thus £1,350 instead of £900, then £450 of additional capital would be needed in order to carry on business on the same scale, and this would exert a proportionate pressure on the money market, greater or less according to its condition. If all capital available on it was already taken up, then there would be increased competition for available capital. If a part of it lay idle, then it would be proportionately called into action. But there can also be a third case, when, with a given scale of production, given velocity of turnover, and given prices of the elements of fluid productive capital, the price of the products of business X falls or rises. If the price of the commodities supplied by business X falls, then the price of its commodity capital of £600, which it is constantly casting into circulation, sinks to £500, for example. Thus, 1/6 of the value of the capital advanced does not return from the circulation process. The surplus value concealed in the commodity capital is left out of consideration here. It is lost in it. But since the value or price of the elements of production remains the same, this reflux of £500 is only sufficient to replace 5/6 of the capital of £600 engaged in the production process. £100 of additional money capital must be advanced, therefore, if production is to be continued on the same scale. Conversely, if the price of the products of business X rose, then the price of the commodity capital would rise from £600 to, say, £700. 1/7 of its price, £100, does not derive from the production process, was not advanced to it, but rather flows in from the circulation process. But still, only £600 is needed to replace the productive elements, and so £100 is set free. The reason why in the first case the turnover period is reduced or prolonged, and in the second case the prices of raw materials and labor, in the third case the prices of the products supplied, rise or fall, does not belong within the orbit of our investigation so far. What does belong here, however, is this. Case 1. Scale of production remaining the same. Constant prices of elements of production and products change in the period of circulation, and hence in the turnover period. On the assumptions of our example, 1/9 less total capital is needed as a result of the reduction in the circulation period, so that this capital is reduced from £900 to £800, and £100 in money capital is precipitated out. Business X continues to supply the same 6 weekly product with the same value of £600, and since work continues uninterruptedly throughout the year, it turns out in 51 weeks the same quantity of products, with a value of £5,100. Thus, as far as the quantity and price of the product that the business casts into circulation is concerned, no change takes place, and so neither is there a change in the terms on which it is put into the market. But £100 is precipitated, since by reducing the circulation period, the process can be completed with a capital advance of £800, instead of £900 as previously. The £100 of capital that has been precipitated exists in the form of money capital, But this is in no way the same part of the capital advance that always had to function in the form of money capital. Let us suppose that of the fluid capital 600 pounds, that was advanced, 4/5 was always laid out on materials of production, making 480 pounds, and 1/5, equaling 120 pounds, on wages. Capital 2, 300 pounds, must therefore be similarly divided into 4/5 totaling 240 pounds for material elements of production and 1/5 totaling 60 pounds for wages. The capital laid out on wages must always be advanced in the money form. As soon as the commodity product, to the sum of 600 pounds, has been transformed back into the money form, has been sold, 480 pounds of it can be transformed into material elements of production, into a productive stock, but 120 pounds maintains its money form to serve for 6 weeks' payment of wages. This 120 pounds is the minimum part of the returned capital of 600 pounds, which must always be replaced and renewed in the form of money capital, and hence must always be present as a part of the capital advance which functions in the money form. Now if, of the 300 pounds that is periodically set free for 3 weeks and is also divisible into a productive stock of 240 pounds and wages of 60 pounds, 100 is precipitated out in the form of money capital as a result of the reduced circulation time. Being completely withdrawn from the turnover mechanism, the question arises, where does the money for this 100 pounds money capital come from? Only a fifth part of it consists of the money capital periodically set free within the turnovers. The remaining 4/5, 80 pounds, has already been replaced by additional productive stock of the same value. By what means is this additional productive stock transformed into money, and where does the money for this conversion come from? If the reduction in circulation time has already taken place, then only 400 pounds out of the above 600, instead of 480, is transformed back into a production stock. The remaining 80 pounds is kept in its money form and composes, together with the above 20 pounds for wages, the 100 pounds of capital precipitated. Even though this 100 pounds is derived from the circulation sphere by the sale of the 600 pounds commodity capital and is now withdrawn from this, insofar as it is not laid out again on wages and materials of production, it should not be forgotten that, in the money form, it is once more in the same form as that in which it was originally cast into circulation. At the beginning, 900 pounds in money was laid out on production stock and wages. In order to keep the same production process going, only 800 pounds is now needed. The 100 pounds thus precipitated out in the money form now constitutes a new money capital seeking investment, a new element on the money market. Certainly, it already existed periodically in the form of money capital set free and in the form of superfluous productive capital, but these latent states were themselves conditions for the accomplishment of the process, as preconditions of its continuity. Now they are no longer needed, and therefore form new money capital and a component of the money market, even though they are in no way either a superfluous element of the existing social money stock, since they existed at the start of the business and were cast into circulation by it, or a newly accumulated hoard. This 100 pounds now really is withdrawn from circulation, inasmuch as it is a part of the money capital advance that is no longer applied in the same business. But this withdrawal is only possible because the transformation of commodity capital into money and of this money into productive capital, C' to M to C, has been accelerated by a week, so that the circulation of the money engaged in this process is also similarly accelerated. It has been withdrawn from circulation because it is no longer needed for the turnover of capital X. It is assumed here that the capital advance belongs to the person who uses it. It would, however, in no way change things if it were borrowed. With the reduction in circulation time, only 800 pounds of borrowed capital would be needed instead of 900 pounds. If 100 pounds were repaid to its lender, this would once again form additional money capital, only it would be in Y's hands instead of X's. Furthermore, if capitalist X receives his material elements of production to the value of 480 pounds on credit, so that all he has to advance himself in money is 120 pounds for wages, he would now have to obtain on credit an amount of the material elements of production to the value of 80 pounds less, which is therefore so much additional commodity capital for the credit-giving capitalist, while capitalist X has also precipitated out 20 pounds in money. The additional production stock is now reduced by 1/3. It was previously 240 pounds, 4/5 of 300 pounds, the additional capital 2. It is now only 160 pounds, i.e. an additional stock for 2 weeks instead of 3. It is now replaced every 2 weeks instead of every 3, but this is stock only for 2 weeks instead of for 3. Purchases, on the cotton market, for instance, are repeated more frequently and in smaller quantities. The same amount of cotton is withdrawn from the market since the quantity produced remains the same, but the withdrawal is differently distributed in time and over a longer period. Let us assume, for instance, that there was originally a renewal of the production stock every 3 months and a subsequent reduction of the renewal time to 2 months. The annual consumption of cotton is 1,200 bales. In the first case, sales were as follows: On the 1st of January, 300 bales, leaving 900 bales in the warehouse. On the 1st of April, 300 bales, leaving 600 bales in the warehouse. On the 1st of July, 300 more, leaving 300 in the warehouse, and on the 1st of October, 300 bales, leaving none in the warehouse. In the second case, on the other hand, we have, on the 1st of January, 200 bales sold, leaving 1,000 in the warehouse. The 1st of March, 200, leaving 800 in the warehouse. The 1st of May, a further 200, leaving 600 in the warehouse. To the 1st of July, of 200, leaving 400 in the warehouse. And the 1st of September, a further 200, leaving 200 more in the warehouse. And the 1st of November, selling 200 and leaving none in the warehouse. The money invested in cotton, therefore, only completes its return 1 month later, in November instead of in October. Thus, if as a result of the reduction in the circulation time, and hence in the turnover, 1/9 of the capital advanced, i.e. 100 pounds, is precipitated out in the form of money capital, and this 100 pounds is composed of 20 pounds that was a periodic excess money capital for the payment of wages, and 80 pounds that previously existed as a periodic excess production stock for 1 week, then corresponding to this 80 pounds reduction in the surplus production stock on the part of the manufacturer, there will be an increased commodity stock in the hands of the cotton broker. The same cotton lies as much longer in the broker's warehouse as a commodity as it exists for a shorter time as a production stock in the stores of the manufacturer. We previously assumed that the reduction in circulation time in X's business depended on X selling his commodities more quickly, or else being paid for it more quickly, i.e. on a reduction in the length of credit. Such a reduction is based on reducing time for the sale of the commodity, i.e. for the transformation of commodity capital into money capital, C' to M, the first phase of the circulation process. It could also arise, however, from the second phase, M to C, i.e. from a simultaneous alteration either in the working period or in the circulation time of capitals Y, Z, etc., which supply capitalist X with the elements of production of his fluid capital. If cotton, coal, etc., for instance, took 3 weeks with the old means of transport to travel from their place of production or their depot to the site of capitalist X's place of production, then the minimum productive stock that X had to hold pending the arrival of new stocks had to be sufficient for at least 3 weeks. As long as cotton and coal are in transit, they cannot serve as means of production. They form instead the object of labor for the transport industry and the capital employed in it, and commodity capital in circulation for the coal producer or the cotton broker. Now let improved means of transport reduce the journey to 2 weeks. The production stock can then be transformed from a 3-week supply into one of 2 weeks. An additional capital of 80 pounds that was advanced is now set free, and so is 20 pounds for wages, because the capital of 600 pounds completes its turnover and returns 1 week sooner. If, on the other hand, the working period of the capital that supplies the raw material is reduced, as in the examples given in the previous chapters, then it also becomes possible to replace the raw material in less time. This then permits a reduction in the productive stock, and a shortening in the time between one replacement period and the next. If, inversely, the circulation time and hence the turnover period is prolonged, an advance of additional capital is needed. This comes from the pockets of the capitalist himself if he possesses extra capital. But this will have been invested in some form or other as a part of the money market. In order to make it available, it must be prized out from its old form. For example, shares sold, deposits withdrawn, so that here too there is an indirect effect on the money market. Alternatively, the capitalist has to raise the capital. As far as the part of the capital needed for wages is concerned, in normal circumstances this is always advanced as money capital, and to this extent capitalist X exerts his share of direct pressure on the money market. For the part to be invested in raw materials, etc., this is only indispensable if he has to pay cash. If he can get it on credit, then he does not exert a direct influence on the money market, as the additional capital is then advanced directly as a productive stock, and not in the first instance as money capital. Insofar as his creditor directly puts the bill received from X back into the money market, has it discounted, etc., this has an indirect, second-hand effect on the money market. But if he uses this bill to meet a debt that he has later to settle, then this additionally advanced capital has neither a direct nor an indirect effect on the money market. Case 2. Change in the price of materials of production, all other circumstances being unchanged. We have just assumed that, of the total capital of 900 pounds, 4/5, totaling 720 pounds, is laid out on material elements of production, and 1/5, totaling 180 pounds, on wages. If the price of raw materials, etc., falls by half, then these require only 240 pounds for the 6-week working period, instead of 480 pounds, and only 120 pounds in additional capital 2, instead of 240. Capital 1 is now reduced from 600 pounds to 240 plus 120, totaling 360 pounds, and capital 2 from 300 pounds to 120 plus 60, totaling 180 pounds. The total capital of 900 pounds is reduced to 360 plus 180, totaling 540 pounds. 360 pounds is thus precipitated. This precipitated money capital, which is now unoccupied and is therefore seeking investment on the money market, is simply a fragment of the capital of £900 originally advanced as money capital, which has now become superfluous, owing to the fall in the price of the elements of production into which it is periodically transformed. That is, if the business is not expanded, but rather continued on the old scale. If this fall in price was not due to accidental circumstances, a particularly good harvest, oversupply, etc., but to an increased productivity in the branch of industry that supplies the raw material, then the unoccupied money capital would be an absolute addition to the money market, an absolute addition to the capital available in the form of money capital, because it has ceased to form an integral component of the capital already invested. Case 3. Change in the market price of the product itself. In the case of a fall in price, a part of the capital is lost and is therefore to be replaced by a new advance of money capital. This loss for the seller may be recouped by the buyer. Directly, if the market price of the product has been affected only by accidental conjunctures, and the price subsequently rises again to its normal level. Indirectly, if the change in price has been brought about by a change in value reacting on the old product, and if this product again enters another sphere of production as an element of production and sets free a proportionate amount of capital there. In both cases, the capital lost by X, capital which he endeavors to replace by exerting pressure on the money market, can be supplied by his business friends as new additional capital. There is then only a transfer. If the price of the product rises, on the other hand, then a portion of capital that was not advanced is appropriated from the circulation sphere. This is not an organic part of the capital advanced in the production process, and if production is not extended, it forms precipitated money capital. Though it is assumed here that the prices of the elements of the product were given before the latter entered the market as a commodity capital, this price increase could still have been caused by a real change in value, to the extent that this had a retroactive effect, for example if raw materials had subsequently risen in value. In this case, capitalist X would have profited both on his product, circulating as commodity capital, and on his existing production stock. This profit would then supply him with the additional capital he now needs to carry on his business as a result of the increased prices of the elements of production. Alternatively, the price rise might only be transitory. What one capitalist then needs as extra capital is precipitated out elsewhere to the extent that his product forms an element of production for other branches of business. What the one lost, the other has gained.